Most people don't want to know you. They want to know the version of you that they're most comfortable with. I came across that on Threads and I saved it because it disrupted me. It disrupted my thoughts. And I've been kind of turning it over in my head ever since because we talk a lot about authenticity like it's a virtue that we all share. We talk about it like wanting to be known, like really known is this universal desire. And maybe the wanting is, but I'm not sure that the receiving is. I think that's a different story entirely. Hey, lovers. This is Sex in Real Life. Honest conversations about sex and relationships beyond 40. I'm your host, Stacey Herrera. Here's what I actually think is happening when we say we want authenticity. I think that we want people to be real to a point. We want honesty as long as the truth doesn't make us uncomfortable. We want to see people as long as the version that we see is what we've already decided on. Because the moment someone shows us a part of themselves that we aren't expecting, whether that's they're angry, there's a contradiction, maybe they're needy, or they have an opinion that just rubs you the wrong way, then something shifts. Like we flinch, we pull back, we decide that something is wrong with them or something is wrong with us, or that the relationship is probably not a good idea anymore. That might feel like self-protection. We might even call it having standards or knowing what we want. We might even say it's setting boundaries or whatever. But sometimes, most of the time, all of the time, sometimes, I think that it's just self-protection. I think it's just self-protection because discomfort is uncomfortable. I mean, that's it, right? But it goes both ways because, we also perform authenticity. We curate our own realness. We share parts of ourselves, but mostly just the parts that are digestible and relatable and the parts that feel safe enough to share. And then we keep the rest. We're not trying to be dishonest. It's just that we learned really early that we can't be our full selves with everybody. You know, we can't be our full selves with most people, is what we learn. But then we wonder why we feel unseen. Feeling unseen and being unseen is not always the same thing. Sometimes we feel unseen because the people around us aren't paying attention. But sometimes it's because we aren't showing all the way up. We get so good at managing what we want other people to know about us that we forget how to be ourselves. And then the person sitting across from you, like if that's the person that you are married to or the love of your life or someone you're building a life with, they only know how to respond to the version of you that they've been seeing, right? My partner and I, we see the world in some pretty fundamentally different ways. He tends to lean toward more black and white, absolute kind of thinking. And I'm more of a, gray area kind of gal. So on any given day, there could be a news story that we both see from completely different angles. And what starts out as a conversation can get spirited pretty quickly. But we have learned, and it took time, we have learned the difference between an argument and a discussion, right? Between two people fighting to win and two people who are willing to stay in friction long enough to understand each other. And that's no small thing. Most people never really get there. And I'm not saying it's easy. It isn't. It's not easy to get there and it's not easy to stay there because, friction is genuinely uncomfortable and the brain will do almost anything to make discomfort stop. So this relationship that I have with my partner is not built in the absence of disagreement, but in the tolerance of or for it. We have a willingness to keep showing up as ourselves, even maybe especially when our authentic selves are inconvenient for one another. And that's what authenticity looks like in practice. It's not harmony all the time. It's definitely not harmony all the time. It's not two people that never clash, because honest friction is not about like flattening yourself to keep the peace, but about allowing the heat of the friction to help you to continue evolving and growing. And that brings me to something that I think gets misunderstood about authenticity often. Authenticity doesn't mean being the same with everyone. It doesn't mean saying everything you think to everyone who asks. It doesn't mean radical transparency as a personality trait or, vulnerability as a performance. Ryan Dunlap, who, if you don't follow him on Instagram, you should. I think he's also got stuff on YouTube. He's great. He is a former hostage negotiator. And that was the quote I opened with in this episode. It was from Ryan Dunlap. Someone had reposted it on Threads, and then I found it on YouTube. But anyway, he speaks directly to this kind of thing. Like, he argues that being measured about what you share, when you share it, and with whom is not a form of inauthenticity, but it's emotional intelligence. He's got a video about it. I'm going to post it in the show notes. But like, knowing yourself well enough to know what to share in the moment with the person right in front of you, that is discernment. And discernment requires knowing yourself and, knowing your audience, the person in front of you. So some people can hold everything you have, like everything you are, but some people can't. And discernment is knowing which in any given moment. And sometimes that might look like outgrowing people, because there might have been someone that could hold all of who you were, but not all of who you are, which, outgrowing people is, there's grief to be had about that. Because it doesn't always mean the relationship is over, but it might mean that that version of the relationship is over. But that's an episode for a different day. But let's circle back to long-term partnership. So to bring this interview in that context, we change. That's just fact. The person who you were when you got together is not who you are now. You've been through some things. You've been through some things. You have shifted. Some of the beliefs that you had when you walked into this thing have loosened or dissipated. Some of the things that you needed before are different now. Some of the things that you might have kept to yourself early on because maybe it was too soon or maybe you were unsure, you might have been still trying to figure it out. But like right now, you might have language for them that you need to speak. But have you said them? Have you said those things? Because here's what happens in long-term relationships. We get comfortable, and comfort is good sometimes. It often is an indicator of safety and shared history. It might mean that you don't have to explain everything from the beginning every time. That's great. That feels wonderful. But comfort can also mean static, right? It can mean that both people are just operating on autopilot, because that happens. And you think that you know who each other are, but maybe you don't, because you've been doing the autopilot thing for so long. But then when one of you says something that's not expected, something that doesn't fit the narrative, ins- instead of seeing that through the lens of curiosity, the knee jerk might be to pull away or to shut down or to accuse them of, not being real. And that can send a message that it's not safe to be authentic. And you really don't want that in your most intimate relationships. There is something else that is probably worth naming here, and that has to do with the difference between being stretched and being unsafe. The human brain is wired for survival, and anything new, anything that disrupts the pattern your nervous system has gotten comfortable with will register as a potential threat. And usually this is completely unconscious. But underneath that, you know, your body is running its own calculation alongside your nervous system. Like, is this known? Is this safe? Is this something that we can predict? And I'm using air quotes here. But growth, by definition, is uncomfortable and it feels unsafe. So when a relationship stretches you, when someone sees something in you that maybe you don't even have a full hold on yet, it might challenge something, and that will show up as unfamiliar and that might feel unsafe. Not because it necessarily is threatening, but just because, the nervous system doesn't always know the difference between a threat and a challenge. They feel the same. So there is a such thing as genuine unsafety in a relationship, and that's real. And if that's your experience, I trust that you know that for your own life. But what I'm talking about here is the discomfort that is sometimes gets mislabeled. Like when a relationship is asking something of you and your nervous system labels it a red flag because it's easier to make something feel unsafe than it is to say that you're scared. And feeling scared doesn't always mean that you're unsafe. Sometimes we leave relationships that were good for us because they ask too much of us. And sometimes we stay in relationships that are comfortable but completely flat because they don't ask anything of us, right? So when you're being stretched, that's not a threat, but you have to be honest enough with yourself to know which one is going on, if it's an actual threat or if it's just a perceived threat because of discomfort. The version of authenticity that actually serves you in long term relationships is not about being your most unfiltered self at all times. It's about being able to be honest about who you are right now. And that includes the parts of you that you're still figuring out, the contradictions, the things that have changed since you first got in relationships with this person. It's about being with someone who is actually curious about who you are and not just who you were when they fell for you, and also not just the person that they're the version of you that they're most comfortable with, but who you are right now, like right now in this season with everything that you've been through and are currently going through. And being known in that way is not guaranteed, right? But it can be built, and sometimes it has to be rebuilt because it does require both people to keep showing up as themselves and not as their representatives, and you need to be asking yourself honestly, like, when was the last time that I really showed up as my authentic self, even when it was inconvenient or complicated or different what or different from what the person expected, right? Sometimes the feeling of being seen is not always about them at all. for anyone who wants to go deeper on the emotionally intelligence piece, about sharing and conflict and stretching and all that, I really recommend Ryan Dunlap's book. It's called How to Untie a Balloon. The book is about conflict resolution in leadership, but it applies to relationships. So I'll definitely link that in the show notes because I think it's worth exploring. If this episode gave you something to chew on, if this episode gave you something to chew on, I would love it if you shared it with someone you think who might need it. You can post it or text it or just pass it along. And please do follow the show so that episodes show up in your feed on your preferred podcast platform. And if you are liking what you're hearing and you are enjoying the show and you feel like leaving a 5-star rating and a short review, I'd appreciate that. It really does help more people find these conversations. Next week, I'm not really sure what we'll be talking about, but I know it's going to be good. So I hope to see you back here. And if there is something that you would like to hear, something that you've been chewing on that you'd like to explore here on the show, I am open to that as well. I will leave a link for suggestions in the show notes. Until next time, ciao.